Hi and welcome to the Mancal Foundation. In this video with our students, we talk about the topic of minimum wages. Now, the idea behind minimum wages is ensuring a basic quality of life for everyone. Now, that of course is a really laudable aim, it's a nice idea, but what matters is not having a nice idea, but actually achieving it in reality. And minimum wages, unfortunately, are not the best way of doing that. Minimum wages can involve additional costs that are distributed unfairly. At times, they fail to help those who really need help, while at other times, helping those who don't need any assistance at all. Minimum wages are a nice idea, but they're unfortunately not the best approach to solving an issue of welfare. To find out more, watch the video, and please feel welcome to leave your comments or questions at the end. Okay, hi everybody and welcome to today's seminar on minimum wages. Thanks for coming in, good to see you all, some new faces, some old faces, great to have some of our Mancal scholars back again. Today we're going to talk about minimum wages. And minimum wages are a political hot topic. People get really emotional and pick their sides about this, but I think that we really need to take a bit of a different approach. So minimum wages, they're simply a means of ensuring welfare, based on the assumption that wealth is derived from participation in the labour market, which is generally a fair assumption. There's an assumption of an imbalance of power between labour and capital, often on the part of those who most strongly promote minimum wages. And there's sometimes the allegation that without minimum wages, unscrupulous employers would just drive wages down, force people to work for slave labour, and that's based in this assumption that capital outweighs labour and that there are actually benefits to driving down wages. I'd argue that really there aren't. The third alleged reason, really it's a subset of the first, is to deal with the cost of living. But unfortunately, much of the high cost of living we experience is due to government regulation and subsidies, and energy costs go through the roof because the government keeps subsidising producers, not consumers, and bringing in new regulations that heap costs on producers, and hey, someone always has to pay. So mandating higher wages to deal with a higher cost of living is a bit hypocritical, and it can actually lead to a self-reinforcing loop. Now, as I said a few seconds ago, okay, so first big problem that we face with minimum wages are the jobs. Minimum wages destroy jobs. There's no getting around that fact. Some people politically engaged in favour of minimum wages like to argue otherwise, but if you raise the price of a product, people are going to demand less of it. Simple economics. And what's maybe even worse is that a lot of jobs are not created in the first place. It's what Frederick Bastiat called the unseen damage caused by government intrusion into voluntary markets. Now here's the standard economics supply and demand graph for those of you who've done the economics, business, finance here. We've got this supply curve in blue sloping upwards, demand curve in red sloping downwards. We're treating this as the market for labour. We find that where the green line goes through there, supply and demand intersect at $25, and you've got a set number of people who will be employed at that price. However, if you then go and mandate a minimum wage not of $25 but of $55, you find, of course, that the number of people employed falls accordingly. These graphs tend to be a bit of an abstraction, but they illustrate the point fairly well. Raise the price of anything and less of it is demanded. If we believe in creating jobs, let's get out of the way of people who want to create them and people who want to take them up, and let that market do its bit. So the danger in setting the minimum wage too high is that you're interfering where you weren't needed, and some of these people who may have still been happy to earn $25 will end up earning nothing. Now, someone always has to pay. We're all adults here. And I have to ask, when it comes to the minimum wage, how's it fair, that argument about fairness, how's it fair that one person should pay more money in order that another receive more money? Some on the left may say, well, it's fair because some are wealthy and the poor should deserve it more. But why, first of all, should that judgment of society broadly fall on the shoulders of one employer who then has to pay more for his employee? In the real world, not in the theoretical political realm, but these political theories and approaches that get put into legislation have real-world consequences. We need to say, well, okay, that's fine, you can support a high minimum wage, what are you going to do to pay for it? Why, then, I should ask, is it fair if the minimum wage means a poor person has to pay more to purchase a good or service of a university student who might be living in Dalkeith with mum and dad and be starting a high-paid grad job next year? Might not have much money now, but that's the choice they've made, and they know they'll have more money down the track. Why should someone who's poor and might remain so for the foreseeable future, why should they have to chip in more to subsidise this person who's about to start seeing an increase in their lifestyle? Even worse, why should people on minimum wage pay more for goods and services provided by other people on the minimum wage? What's this tipping point here? It's not clear. And that's a good indication that what we're dealing with here are subjective value judgments, not objective economics. And we're just taking money from one person to give to another. There's zero net increase in wealth. In fact, there's a decrease because of all the transaction costs and messing around involved. What we do objectively know is that when you raise the price of a product, as I said before, hey, consumers demand less of it. Some people have little or no choice, and that means that they then just spend less money on other things, be it at a local restaurant, where the staff may be on minimum wages, on having gyms come and mow their lawn, on going to local movie theatre. What you find is that there's then a substitution, one way or the other. Someone is going to lose out here. They're not creating wealth by mandating a higher cost of doing business. Now, academic economists like these neat, constant, sloping supply and demand curves, but in reality, they're really not neat. They vary all the time. They're so difficult to measure and esoteric that they only really exist at a macro level. And even then, they're hard to define. It's an example of Hayek's fatal conceit to assume that the government has any oversight of all the millions of preferences that form the supply and demand behind these curves. It has no way of understanding which lines truly represent supply and demand here, where they intersect, and even if they did, by the time they got around to legislating these prices, maybe the price is here, maybe it's up here, by the time the government got around to putting that into legislation regulation, after it had gone through parliamentary subcommittees, reviews and all the rest, it's all changed. Markets are dynamic, prices change, it's all moved on. So the two takeaway points here are that there's no way of getting the numbers right, and the assumption of static prices in itself is wrong. Now, the minimum wage is the barrier to entry to the market. If you raise the price of getting into a market, you've created a barrier. Who benefits? Those who are already inside the tent. They're the people the most capable and qualified, the best networked, and that includes members of the trade unions, and they're not breaking the law. They do break a law at times, but they are well networked, well protected, and they make sure that they and their members get jobs. How often do you, as young people, go for entry-level jobs and you get told that you need experience? You think, well, how can I get experience if I can't get a job in the first place? It's a catch-22. Well, one way of getting experience is offering to work for less, even offering to work for free. Minimum wages remove that right, so you can't challenge the insiders. It protects the incumbents. Now, those who are often hurt, young people, recent migrants, people with poor language skills. Ironically, and I don't want to be political about this, but the left of politics supports minimum wages, but often it's these recent migrants who are hurt most, but that the left also claim to really represent. So you've got unfortunately, a bit of a trade-off here. In the past, in the US, the minimum wage was designed as a means of pricing immigrant labour out of the market, again preventing people from lowering the price of their labour in order to get a foothold into industry. Like I was saying, let's drop the politics. There's this idea of an imbalance of between capital and labour in favour of capital really doesn't match reality. The reality is that balance is always in flux. And perfect example, mining boom back in the day in Perth, labour was in the ascendant hugely. You couldn't get workers, let alone good workers, for love nor money, no matter how much money you threw, and we saw wages rocket up during that boom. Since then, things have changed, and that balance has come back more in favour of capital. But look, on top of that, driving down wages drives down motivation anyway, and thus productivity. Is like anything in life. As an employer, you get what you pay for. If you're not prepared to pay what people are willing to work for, well, you might find that you're even worse off than you'd otherwise be. There's certainly an element of class warfare among some of the proponents of the minimum wage, some, not all. And look, we can always justify any position we want to take subjectively if we want to get subjective about it. But look, politics doesn't get you far on what's an economic issue. Let's get this out of the 1970s and look at numbers, look at jobs, and just look at how we're going to practically make more people more wealthy. Now, one of my gripes here, but it's a good thing, there's this myth of a minimum wage life. And the really, really good news is studies have shown that very few people remain on the minimum wage, and it's quite logical why. It tends to be a stepping stone. People get experience, they build networks of contacts, so in other words, they're on the inside, and what happens? They start moving upwards. Someone else comes in and takes that minimum wage role as a new opportunity. University students graduating into well-paid jobs are probably most obvious and extreme example, but it does happen right across the economy. And that's another example of how some people on the minimum wage simply don't need it. Many students earn the minimum wage but come from well-off households, while there are many people who work in low or minimum wage jobs because they actually enjoy those jobs. There are some sectors that don't pay well. Charity, working with the aged and so forth, for example. And some people may choose to work and they're on that low minimum wage, but hey, guess what? Their partner is an executive at Chevron or in some other kind of high-paying job, which enables the other partner to go and do what they really love and not worry about money. And hey, isn't that a great thing? So there's this assumption behind the minimum wage that everyone earning it is poor, which is not necessarily the case. Targeting poverty and targeting low wages are not necessarily the same thing. Low wages is not a perfect metric here. I've got to keep that in mind. It's an inefficient means of solving a problem. The minimum wage targets symptoms, in some cases gets false positives, also gets false negatives. So a big problem with the minimum wage is that it corrupts the labour market and the welfare system, forcing the labour market to be a bit of both. Now, if you try and be all things to all people, you tend not being much to anyone. And that's sort of the problem that we have here. It's a labour market, labour's supplied and purchased at a price that suits both parties, but then there's this sort of overlay of a welfare system on top, ensuring that some of those lucky to get work are paid perhaps a bit more than they otherwise would have been prepared to work for, but others will miss out altogether. And like I said before, they're then on an income of zero and they revert to the formal welfare system and cost us much more. And what's much better is if we look at this welfare system separately from the labour market. And this is what you always want to do in talking about policy. There's no point in just bagging out one area and not coming up with any positive, concrete sort of options to improve. This is what I say, a better option, and this is actually what they do in Scandinavia, like in Sweden. Let's let the labour market be a labour market, where labour is bought and sold according to people's preferences, with no broad rules that distort the outcomes and result in some people shouldering more costs for no return and other people getting windfall gains for no effort. Put simply, using that labour market, it's an indirect approach to resolving the welfare problems. We need an actual direct approach. Now, we already have one. Australia has a massive welfare system. It takes up about a third of government spending. I don't like that. I think it's too much, personally. I think it needs to be much better directed. But the point is, we already have a welfare system. There's a hammer and a nail, as opposed to a screwdriver and a nail. We want to use the hammer of the welfare system here. Look, if after we let the labour market be a labour market, cold, hard, supply and demand of labour, unemotional, no value judgments involved, no subjectivity, after it's done its job and everyone is either employed up to a wage rate or not employed, if there are still people working but unable to make ends meet, if there are people who don't have work, then some form of support could come from this massive welfare state that we already have. Maybe direct payments via Centrelink, could be tax breaks, could be negative income tax or universal basic income, which are getting a lot more publicity these days as people wonder about whether there'll be enough jobs in the future. But if society makes this value judgment, this is a value judgment that we want to intervene and look after those who we deem unable to look after themselves, well, that's society's right to do that. And what matters is that society chooses the method that achieves that welfare outcome at maximum efficiency and least cost. So let's make sure that we get it right, that we support the people who need it, we don't support the people who don't need it, and we do it in the cheapest possible way. Now, does that mean? Well, I'd say that's actually making sure that we have enough welfare spending to cover us in the future as well. Now, these are precious welfare dollars. Let's make sure we get the best bang for the buck out of them. We also need to make sure that there are the least amount of distortions to other parts of the economy, the least number of false positives, counterproductive measures, and wrong incentives. Now, what studies and experiences have shown over decades now is that the minimum wage is simply not the best way to achieve a welfare outcome.